Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. So if you're in Greece this week, good luck trying to go to the bank. Greek banks are closed all week after news broke that the country will be holding a referendum vote on whether to accept the bailout measures offered by international creditors. But if the Greek population decides to vote yes for the bailout deal, does this mean that they will be handing creditor banks a bailout? Now joining us to give us their take on the issue are our two guests. Joining us from Quito, Ecuador is Bill Black. Bill is an associate professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He's a white-collar criminologist and a former financial regulator and author of the book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And also joining us from Germany is Michael Hudson. Michael is Distinguished Research Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. His latest book is Killing the Host: How Financial Parasites and Debt Bondage Destroy the Global Economy. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Bill, I'm going to start off with you. Can you just explain to our viewers who's actually getting bailed out in this deal? Are creditor banks the ones benefiting at the end of the day?
Well, the same people are getting bailed out that have been getting bailed out from the beginning of the Greek crisis, and that is foreign banks. So this money just moves in sort of an elaborate circle from the Troika, which is the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, through the Greek government, through the Greek banks, and then they pay the foreign creditors. And they pay them just enough that they don't have to recognize a loss for accounting purposes. As Michael will explain, of late, the big investors tend to be American hedge funds, as opposed to what used to be primarily French banks.
Okay, Michael, I want to ask you about the role of French banks in all of this. Can you just speak to this? Give us a sense of how they even got entangled in Greek debt.
Well, today's problem with the debts really stem back from 2010 and 2011, when Greece it obviously couldn't pay. When Greece joined the Eurozone, it falsified its debt figures. The head of its central bank worked with Goldman Sachs to make a complicated derivatives to hide it all. And that was Lucas Papademos. Well, in 2010, right after the PASOK party came to power in Greece, they revealed the fact that their figures had been fudged all along and that the debt was so large that Greece couldn't pay. So the International Monetary Fund, which hadn't been making loan, almost had no customers in the world, had its European staff calculate, and the staff unanimously said, Greece can't pay these debts. These are fraudulent debts that are way beyond the ability to pay. They've got to be written down. And the board of directors agreed. But Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was the head of the IMF when he wasn't going to the sex parties, wanted to run for president of France. And he talked to Sarkozy, and Sarkozy said, wait a minute, French banks are the largest holders of Greek debt. If Greece doesn't pay and writes them down, the French banks will go under. And German banks were the second. But then at the G8 meetings in 2011, President Obama went over, along with Tim Geithner, and said, our big campaign contributors are on Wall Street, and they've made huge bets that Greece can pay. If Greece doesn't pay, then all these gamblers and derivative players are going to lose their bets. You've got to sacrifice Greece, and you've got to drive it into poverty, and lend the Greek government the money to pay the bondholders so that our Wall Street banks won't lose money. So the European Central Bank told the IMF, if you want to be a player, you've got to ignore what the staff said. And they did. And the European Central Bank and the IMF paid over 100 billion euros to the bondholders. So Greece, instead of owing private bondholders, owed the IMF and the European Central Bank. Now the European Central Bank wants to get paid, but the debts can't be paid. So the central bank says, okay, Greece, sell us your islands, sell us your ports, sell us your land, sell us your raw materials. This is foreclosure time. And if you can't pay, we want everything in the public domain. And you also have to impose austerity. You have only 20% of your population is emigrated. You only have a 60% unemployment rate for youth. You've got to increase the unemployment rate to 80%, double the immigration in order to for us to make the loans to your government that will turn right around and pay us.
Okay,
And
but Michael, there
extends.
really could be real consequences. You mentioned obviously financial markets. There's some real consequences for them. But what about everyday people? I'm thinking of those folks who might have their money in banks, in the banking system, and if this bank is insolvent, what would happen to them?
There need not have been any consequences for the people at all of Greece not paying the IMF and not paying the European Central Bank, because this money was all paper money created to begin with. It's just a book loss. But the Europeans said something else, that although we don't need the money, we will bankrupt you and we will cause a bank crisis if you don't comply with what we want. So it's either austerity or we will smash and grab. Take your pick.
Bill, I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you do if you're a person who's going to be facing that referendum vote? Do you vote no for this bill, or do you say yes and hope for the best?
Well, I would definitely vote against the bankers. What is the other thing, as Michael is correct, but on top of that, the Troika said it's not enough that 60% of your pensioners are in poverty. We want to push it so 70 or 80% of your pensioners are below the poverty level as well. And privatization, this is what made, depending on the poll, Carlos Slim the richest or the second richest person in the world. They're sold on sweetheart terms to cronies, and this is crony capitalism. Basically, if people are familiar with Indonesia under Suharto, it's very similar. What do you do is, as Michael said, the normal thing that has been done in the past is to write down the debts when they can't be paid. That is done all the time, routinely in the commercial world, and it was done with Latin America back in the debt crisis in the 70s and 80s with what became known as the Brady Plan. So you can't keep a country, or at least there's no economically rational basis for doing so, and of course it's completely inhumane, to keep a country in a condition where it constantly will be in ever greater debt. And that's precisely what the Troika wants to do. And as Michael has said, German politicians have openly demanded that Greece begin selling islands. In other words, selling the nation. Just a complete destruction of sovereignty.
All right, Bill Black and Michael Hudson, we're going to pause the conversation here. In part two, we'll talk more about specifics related to alternatives to this deal. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Be here.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.